Hey, let's go ahead and get started. When people join, I'll go ahead and let them in. We are continuing our discussion today on bones, and we had stopped the other day on the intramembranous ossification, and we're going to go on past that. A couple things I want to let you know. I have extended the due dates on every exam until December the 9th. That is the Thursday of exam week. So all lecture exams and all lab exams are now due on December the 9th. I decided it was a whole lot easier than to keep moving dates around as we, to adjust for schedules. The only thing about that is that I can't go past that date. That's the last day of the semester. I can't change that date. There's nothing I can do about that. So you have to have everything done, before that. You have to have it. You have to get everything done by December the 9th. That's the only burden on you. Take the exams at your convenience when you're ready for them, but just know that I cannot go past that date. The semester ends, and I have no recourse after that. So just to let you know. So anyway, so enough of that. Let's move on. And let's move into today's content. Bring it up. Why didn't get out of this? Press the right button for a change. Here we go. Okay. So the other day we were talking about the intramembranous ossification and the endochondral ossification. We know that our bones are formed. Our skeleton is formed from cartilage bones. It's sort of an oxymoron there, but we do refer to the hyaline cartilage bone as a bone, because it does take the shape of our bone. It functions as our bone while we're in utero. And by 6 weeks after conception, we have a full skeleton laid out. Both, probably 99% of it is cartilage, and the remaining 1% is membrane, for the bones of the skull. And gradually we ossify through two similar processes. We ossify the membranes to form the bones of the skull, and we ossify everything else, the hyaline cartilage. And that whole process takes about 20 plus years. So it isn't until our early 20s, 22, 23, 24, that we have finally closed all of our long bone growth and closed all of our membranes. Remember that we have the membranes are ideal for the brain, because the brain's going to expand, and the skull has to be able to expand with it. Our head is already disproportionate to the rest of our body when we're born. We have a larger head than we do the rest of our body, because our brain is bigger and getting bigger. So after we're born, this is what postnatal means. After we're born, we continue to see long bone growth at the epiphyseal plates. And we'll see this occur gradually through childhood. The pace will increase dramatically during puberty, and then slow down greatly during adolescence, as adolescence ends. And we will see growth spurts over time in a short period of time. We generally see females will go through their growth spurts earlier than males do. It's because of the presence of estrogen stimulates osteoblast bone building activity. It also shuts it down. With estrogen levels rising after puberty starts in the female's body, that will stimulate bone growth, and you'll get your growth spurt. And so your female going through puberty will reach her adult stature earlier than a male will. Testosterone stimulates bone growth, but it's slower, and it takes a greater accumulation of testosterone to shut down any further growth. The epiphyseal plates don't completely close, as I said, till somewhere around the age of 23. After that, after longitudinal growth stops, we have what's known as appositional growth, where we grow, our bones will change in thickness from side to side. And our bones will respond to the stresses or the lack of stresses we place on them by getting thicker or thinner. And they'll be constantly reshaped over our lifetime. We do see that it is normal, however, that some bones do not stop growing, and that is bones of the face. For some reason, the facial bones will continue to grow very, very slowly, but they will continue to grow. So a forehead can enlarge, a nose, an older individual's nose can enlarge. Don't always, but many do. Now, so longitudinal growth is at the epiphyseal plates, and that stops when those plates close and all you have left is the line. And appositional growth is going to be side to side. That will continue the rest of our lives. Even though we're not going to grow any longer, we can still grow from side to side. This, again, this is the epiphyseal plate. This is a nice little drawing, but it's more important to understand it is the growth plates, the epiphyseal growth plates, that give us our longitudinal growth. That's what gives you that dark band that you see on X-ray that shows you that the dark band is really where hyaline cartilage is. So remember, soft tissue like hyaline cartilage is not visible on X-ray. It's there. We can't see it on the X-ray, but it's there. It's when that closes and you get a white line that shows that the growth plates have closed. The epiphyseal line is what's all that's left when the plates close. I just said that several times. The growth plates are visible on X-ray, but as a dark band, and then when they close, all you have is a white line on the bone. So now we do have to control our growth. We use our hormones for that. And you're going to hear a lot more about hormones in the first chapter, actually the whole first unit in AP2. Now, obviously, growth hormone plays a major role here. Growth hormone stimulates protein synthesis. It stimulates the epiphyseal plates to make more bone as we grow from infancy into childhood, into adolescence, and into young adulthood. Now, we also need energy for this, and this is where the thyroid hormone comes in. One of the things that we emphasize is that these hormones in our bodies don't act independently. Many of them work together. Some work against each other antagonistically, but many of them work together. Growth hormone needs energy. Thyroid hormone controls our metabolic rate. How rapidly do we oxidize glucose, for example? And so when we release growth hormone to stimulate bone growth, we're also going to have thyroid hormone to provide the energy for that growth. And so it helps to, it's sort of like a check and balance on the growth hormone. Without enough thyroid hormone to stimulate our metabolism, we're not going to get the bone growth we want. This is where diet and nutrition plays a big role in bone growth. Something else that affects us are the sex hormones. Testosterone and estrogen stimulate the epiphyseal plates. They stimulate bone growth, and that's a good thing. However, as those levels of testosterone and estrogen climb, we get more and more bone growth, but they become a negative effect. Higher concentrations of the sex hormones will actually shut down the epiphyseal plates, and that's what happens. We have our growth spurts, and then we stop. We may have another growth spurt and then we stop, and then that may be our adult stature. This is what happens in the female body, as I said. The high levels of estrogen that are occurring as ovulations occurs every month, and the rise of estrogen and progesterone, they actually, in high concentrations, which they will achieve, actually inhibit. They actually inhibit any more epiphyseal plate activity, so that your adolescent female going through puberty has her growth spurt and reaches her adult stature earlier, much earlier than the male does. Male lags probably, the onset of puberty in a male may be a year, maybe 2 years later than the female, and the growth spurt will occur, proportionally distant, time-wise down the road. Those growth spurts are what give us our adult stature. Now, there are things that can happen. There are all sorts of things that can happen. I'll show you some clinical conditions here in a little bit. Excessive amounts of growth hormone can cause gigantism. Reduced amounts of growth hormone throughout childhood cause something called pituitary dwarfism, where you, if uncontrolled or untreated, results in the adult stature of an individual as a pituitary dwarf of about 4 feet tall, and that's all. Perfectly normal proportions, perfectly normal body, everything functions just fine, except that they did not reach their predetermined, their genetically predetermined adult stature. So, or an individual with excessive growth hormone from childhood on that doesn't shut down when they hit puberty, when they end puberty, can often result in an individual exceeding 8 feet tall. So there are all sorts of things that can go. I guess you could say that abnormal. I don't want to say they go wrong, but they're abnormal. They're not what we expect to see. So the hormones, the sex hormones, play a big role, as I've said this several times. Notice how estrogen and testosterone look almost identical, and that's because they are. They're steroid-based hormones. They have a 4-ring structure, but the functional groups that attach to the rings are slightly different. That makes tremendous impact here. Estrogens and the androgens. Now, the androgens are produced, those are sex hormones produced initially by the adrenal glands. That's why they're called andro, for adrenal. It's essentially testosterone. Now, the androgens are produced in both males and females. In the female, the androgens are converted to estrogen. In the males, it's simply testosterone. This is what usually is thought to trigger the onset of puberty when these values rise. Now, later, the ovaries are going to produce lots and lots of estrogen in the female, and the testes will produce lots and lots of testosterone in the male. Both of these sex hormones will stimulate osteoblast activity at the epiphyseal plate. This is what causes our growth spurt. The high levels of these hormones produce rapid bone growth. Now, estrogens close the epiphyseal plate faster than testosterone does. We get higher levels of estrogen in the female. I've said this several times. This is an important thing to remember. Estrogen also is an osteoblast stimulator. Estrogen causes us to, in the female body, it causes osteoblast activity. Osteoblast is the bone building activity. So we see a rapid bone growth, and then we inhibit, the estrogen inhibits any further epiphyseal growth. Got to have insulin on top of all this. Insulin, we think of insulin as being released by the pancreas when our blood sugar goes up. And that's true. But the presence of insulin also stimulates bone development, stimulates the osteoblasts. The another hormone from the adrenal glands called cortisol. It's what we call a glucocorticoid. You'll hear all about this in AP2. Will work to lay down bone by inhibiting the osteoclasts. The osteoclasts, are the bone breakers, the bone destroyers. They have the remember the osteoclast, large cell, lots of lysosomes, dissolved bones, porous. Glucocorticoids will inhibit the osteoclasts. So again, we're going to be laying down a lot of bone. And remember, this isn't just longitudinal growth. This is appositional growth too. Glucocorticoids inhibit osteoclasts, so we're not going to break down as much bone. We're not going to break down bone. Presence of insulin stimulates osteoblasts. Estrogen stimulates osteoblasts. Problem comes in later in life in the female. The postmenopausal female isn't releasing a whole lot of estrogen anymore. The ovaries have shut down. So she may not be producing enough bone cells to stay in a positive balance between the buildup and the breakdown. Once the estrogen levels drop, osteoblast activity drops. So there's always a problem there later in the postmenopausal female. Always a problem later in life with the development of osteoporosis. We'll talk more about that a little later on here. Now, the two key hormones that regulate calcium, because you can't have bone without calcium. There are two key hormones that regulate blood calcium levels. Because you got to have, you can have all the estrogen you want. If you don't have calcium, you're not going to lay down bone. So you got to have calcium. But everything else wants calcium too. We got to have calcium for blood clotting. Without calcium, we don't clot properly. Without calcium, our muscles don't contract properly. Our skeletal muscle depends heavily on calcium. Our cardiac muscle depends very heavily on calcium. Without calcium, we don't have nerve impulses. We don't generate nerve impulses properly. So there's all sorts of things that depend on calcium. And if we don't have that calcium in our diet, where are we going to get it? Well, we're going to break down our bone. We're going to dissolve bone to get the calcium. And the two hormones that control our blood calcium levels are antagonistic. They're parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. They work by either breaking down our bone to release calcium or building up our bone to store calcium. So these are antagonistic hormones, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. They work against each other to regulate the calcium levels in the blood. We have to have a certain amount of calcium in the blood for all of the non-bone activities to work, in addition to putting bone in, to keeping our bones strong. So they are going to affect the absorption of calcium, the reabsorption of bone to release calcium, and the deposition of calcium in bone. Parathyroid hormone and calcitonin, because we've got to maintain the proper level of calcium in our blood. So why do we care about calcium? Well, see, we're always remodeling. We're constantly remodeling our bone. we recycle our bone mass about 7% a week. I mean, we're dissolving it, sucking out the calcium, and then rebuilding it. Our entire volume of spongy bone is replaced every 4 years. All the spongy bone in the diploe and at the ends of the long bones and everywhere else we have spongy bone, totally replaced and rebuilt every 4 years. Compact bone, the hard outer bone, is completely new. We essentially have a completely new skeleton in place every 10 years. And so we're always laying down bone, and we're always dissolving bone. We're always reshaping it. And we use and this takes place at the periosteum, where we have the osteoblasts and osteoclasts, and on the endosteum, where we also have osteoblasts and osteoclasts. And the osteoblasts are building up bone right next to osteoclasts that are tearing it down. And we're tearing it down so we can remodel it and make it better than it was before. We can make it stronger, or we can make it weaker. Because the ability to tear down bone or build up bone depends on the demands we're placing on our bone. If you exercise, if your patient exercises, eats lots of protein for their muscles, and they exercise their muscles are going to get bigger and stronger, and their bones are going to respond by getting bigger and stronger so that the muscles can pull on them. Conversely, if your patient doesn't exercise, doesn't eat a lot of protein, doesn't do anything, is rather sedentary, meaning they don't do any kind of physical activity, then their bones will likely get weaker. Not likely, but will get weaker. And the bones are going to get weaker. Now, those hormones I mentioned, calcitonin and parathyroid hormone, help to control, they're one of the controls here on our bone remodeling. It's all done through negative feedback. If blood calcium levels get too low, we're going to dissolve bone to get the calcium back up. We're going to release that calcium into the blood. If blood calcium levels get too high, we're going to lay down bone. We're going to build bone up so that we can suck up that extra calcium and store it in the bone. Most of the calcium in our bodies is all found in bone. As I said, you see here nerve impulses, muscle contractions, coagulation, cell division. Who knew? Who knew that cytokinesis involved calcium? The release of chemicals from our glands and from our nerves, all controlled by the presence of calcium. So we have to have a lot of calcium available to do things. It isn't just about making strong bones. So we use these hormones, calcitonin and parathyroid hormone, to regulate our calcium levels. We also respond to stress. The stresses that we apply to our bones, the stresses in our bones are going to determine, the stresses that affect our bones are going to determine whether they build up or tear down. So calcitonin, where does it come from? The parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland. You're going to learn all about the location of this in AP2. But within our thyroid gland, a little butterfly-shaped gland in the middle of our neck releases calcitonin when blood calcium levels go up, and it stimulates osteoblast activity. So calcitonin released by the thyroid gland is going to produce calcium, going to stimulate osteoblasts. Now, this is not a significant player. The calcitonin works when blood calcium goes up. But blood calcium very rarely ever goes up. We're usually in a deficit on blood calcium. But on those rare occasions, if blood calcium does go up, it will the calcitonin will get produced, and we will start laying down bone. The primary hormone that regulates blood calcium levels is parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid glands are embedded on the back side of the thyroid. There are 4 of them. They have about the size and shape of a raisin. So there are 4 little raisin-like structures here. They release parathyroid hormone when blood calcium levels get too low. The parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone. It's just like, how does negative feedback work? We get a stimulus, and the response is to reverse the stimulus. So if our blood calcium level is too low, we reverse the stimulus by bringing it back up. And that's what parathyroid hormone does. It stimulates breakdown of bone. It also tells us to start getting more calcium out of our small intestine in our diet, and also recovering more calcium in our kidneys. And on top of all that, it inhibits osteoblasts. And when we get back, I haven't said it for a while, but when we reach our homeostatic level of calcium in our blood, we reverse the stimulus and we stop negative feedback. Now, this is the negative feedback loop for calcitonin. If blood calcium levels ever rise, and they may, on occasion, but they're usually in a negative balance. If the blood calcium levels go up, as you see here in the left-hand side of the picture, then that will stimulate the release of calcitonin from the thyroid gland, which will do 2 things. It will shut down osteoclasts, the bone-breaking cells, and will stimulate osteoblasts, the bone-building cells. And so you're going to suck up the excess calcium and deposit it into the bones. Doesn't happen often. It can happen, but as I said, our bodies are usually not usually don't have a surplus of calcium. Here are the parathyroid glands. As I said, usually 4 of them on the posterior surface of the thyroid. When blood calcium levels get low, and they nearly always do, we release parathyroid hormone to start breaking down bone. It stimulates osteoclast activity. It inhibits osteoblast activity. It also tells us to absorb more calcium in our small intestine, and tells our kidneys to retain calcium. So we're going after calcium in 3 ways. So this first one, this is, not big and busy flow charts, but this one is a pretty good one. Our blood calcium levels are low. We release parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid glands. Osteoblast activity shuts down. No more bone building for a while. Osteoclast activity increases. We dissolve bone. We release calcium into the blood. We're down here with increased blood calcium. Here, we start producing more vitamin D. Vitamin D, of course, in our skin is made in our skin by exposure to ultraviolet radiation in sunlight. Vitamin D, the role of vitamin D is to allow us to absorb calcium from our small intestine. No vitamin D, no calcium absorption. Calcitriol, here you'll see in AP2, that's the activated version of vitamin D. Anyway, vitamin D allows us to absorb calcium, more calcium in our blood. And the third thing it does is restricts the loss of calcium through our kidneys. So again, the third mechanism, bringing our calcium levels up. So we go out, we not just dissolve our bones, but we increase our uptake through our diet. We increase our uptake by not peeing away as much calcium as we were before. So, and this is, parathyroid hormone is the #1 way to regulate calcium levels. Because we're nearly always in a negative balance here. Problems with calcium. There are two terms, hypocalcemia and hypercalcemia. Both occur in individuals. Hypocalcemia, calcium levels are very low. Hyperexcitability, meaning we stimulate nerve impulses, we stimulate muscle contraction, then we can't do anything else. We stay locked into a contracted state, for example. We respond to a stimulus and we stay responding to it. We can't relax. So that's one condition, hypocalcemia. Hypercalcemia makes us non-responsive. Again, it's like we sort of lock up the ability of the nerves to contract or the muscles to contract. We don't want, in both cases, they frequently, hypo or hypercalcemia can lead to a bad end for us. We don't like that. On a smaller scale, if we keep high levels of calcium in our blood constantly, well, calcium is what causes kidney stones. The renal calculi is what we call it. Kidney stones are crystalline deposits of calcium that, high levels of calcium in our urine cause calcium crystals to deposit inside the kidneys. They get trapped there, and as they're trapped there, they build up and grow, and they create very large stones with very sharp edges, and they can be as large as a quarter. And those very large stones with very sharp edges are extraordinarily painful for individuals that are trying to get them out of their kidneys and pass them through their ureters, through their bladder, through the urethra. So it is a significant problem for individuals, that maintain excessive levels of calcium. Because if some is good, more is not necessarily better. We can overindulge on any kind of food item, on any kind of nutrient. Excessive calcium is not a good thing. Other hormones that come into play here, and yes, it's primarily calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. Of course, calcitonin is not a significant participant here. Leptin plays a role. Leptin is a hormone released by our adipose tissue. Leptin tends to inhibit osteoblast activity, laying down bone. And so does serotonin. Now, serotonin is our mood stabilizer. Serotonin is also helps us sleep at night. Serotonin is, an imbalance in serotonin is what causes depression. Depression has nothing to do with character flaws. Depression is everything about serotonin levels. And it also interferes with osteoblasts. The presence of serotonin will interfere with laying down bone. Excessive serotonin will interfere with this process. Don't know why that has anything to do with bones, but it does. Now, mechanically, this is where I've been trying to emphasize this. Mechanically, our bones respond to stresses. Stresses that are applied to bones will trigger a response. Whenever we move an arm or a leg or a hand or a foot or a finger or a toe or anything, any bone, we're applying stress to it. Continued stress like that causes the bone to remodel itself. It will get stronger. If there's no stress applied, the bone will get weaker. Bones are stressed when weight is put on them or muscles pull on them. So if you're working out and exercising, your muscles are getting stronger and your bones will have to get stronger in response. Now, there is a law. This is the only law that you learn in AP1. It's the only law that applies in AP1. It's called Wolff's Law. Bones grow or remodel in response to demands placed on them. Now, stress can work either way. If there's a great deal of stress applied to bones, the bones will get stronger. Bones will enlarge and get stronger if greater and greater stress is applied to them, like lifting weights or running or routine exercise or work that requires a lot of strenuous and physical activity. Bones are going to grow and remodel based on the demands placed on them. A person who works as a server all day long, on their feet all day long, the bones are going to get stronger because of the demands placed on them. A person in a sedentary occupation who doesn't have a lot of physical activity or has doesn't exercise, the lack of stress will also cause the bones to remodel. Bones will get lighter and weaker. The muscles are going to get weaker. Now, the muscle cells are not going to go away. They're just going to get smaller. But the bone cells can disappear. The bones will get smaller as bone cells are removed through remodeling. Bones will get larger and stronger or smaller and weaker. And so we keep we add bone or we take bone down. And our diaphysis, the shaft of our long bones, will get thicker and will get more thick at the site of the greatest stress. We see this all the time with our, we have right or left hand dominant. Some people are both. What will happen is the arm on the dominant side will have thicker bones. So you can look at a skeleton, a real skeleton of an individual, and determine if they were right hand dominant or left hand dominant simply by the shape of the humerus. It will be thicker on the dominant side. Now, we also see that the area of the points of attachment for the muscles will get thicker and stronger too, depending on if you're putting more stress in the bones through muscle use, then the attachments are going to be stronger, like the deltoid tuberosity, for example, or the radial tuberosity. They're going to become stronger to deal with the greater stresses applied there from exercise, lifting weights, whatever kind of occupation you're involved with, or they are going to become reduced in size. An individual who is bedridden or whatever, a chronic illness, will often have, will frequently have very weak muscles, and bone density will drop dramatically. We see also that astronauts in the space station, I think that's the next slide after this. Astronauts in the space station will often lose a great deal of muscle mass. They won't lose the cells, but they'll lose the muscle mass, and their bones will become very, very weak. If you've been in space for over a year, then it may be very difficult for your body to support its weight when it's exposed to gravity again. Gravity is not our friend, and even though astronauts in the space station will exercise every day, they're using resistance equipment like a Bowflex and a Nordic track and things like that don't, but they can't do that 24 hours a day. Gravity on Earth pulls on us all the time, and we resist the forces of gravity. But in space, there is no gravity. Well, the force of the gravity is negated. It's balanced out by the force. We're not going to go into centrifugal forces, things like that. But so we're essentially weightless when we're in space. Okay, so gravity is canceled out. There is no gravity effect on us. Well, gravity is pulling on our bodies on Earth all the time. And so we're always working against that. It helps to keep our bones and muscles strong. But without gravity, our muscles will weaken because they're not necessary. And our bones will get weaker too. Not unusual to see that, a loss of muscle mass and bone mass. Now, how do the bones know to remodel themselves? Well, it has to do with the nerve impulses produced when we stress the bone. When we stress the bone, that stimulates nerve impulses from the osteocytes to say, hey, we need to get more powerful, or we don't need to get more powerful. The hormones will tell us how to rebuild our bone. Hormonal control will tell us how to rebuild our bone with, stimulating osteoclast or stimulating osteoblast, but the mechanical stress tells us where. Because, when you release calcitonin or when you release parathyroid hormone, it doesn't know where to go. It just gets released. Hormones circulate throughout the body and they land on target cells that match up to them. That's the only way that's the only places they work. Thyroid hormone can go to every cell in the body. Parathyroid hormone only works on bone. Calcitonin only works on bone. Estrogen stimulates osteoblast activity, among all sorts of other things it does for us. But it doesn't, it doesn't know where, it just goes everywhere. The mechanical stresses tell us where we need to grow more bone or break down bone. Mechanical stress is telling us where this has to happen. Because if you're stimulating osteoblast activity through exercise, is it going to affect every bone in your body? We don't need every bone in our body to get larger. We only need the area that's being affected by the mechanical stress. If you're a server and you're standing on your feet all day long, it's not going to do a whole lot to see an enlargement of, your fingers, your phalanges on your non-dominant hand. That's not going to help a whole lot. So, anyway, hormonal controls tell us how to remodel. Mechanical stress tells us where to remodel. And I've said, again, remodeling can be at either, at along the sides. That's where, once our epiphyseal plates have closed, what we have now is remodeling by appositional growth on the side-to-side structure. Our bones don't get longer once they close, but they will get thicker or thinner. Now let's talk about fractures. Many of us have broken bones. We've had, if you've ever experienced one, you likely don't remember the actual fracture event occurring, but you remember the consequences, the pain and the swelling and everything else after it. You can usually pinpoint when it occurred, but most of us don't remember the actual event. Like we don't remember pain. We remember that it hurt, but we don't remember the actual pain itself. Now, when we're younger, most of our fractures come from trauma. Usually preceded by the statement, hey, y'all want to watch this? Because we do, there is a certain amount of boldness that we take when we're younger, but also from contact sports and just plain accidents. Accidents happen. And when we're growing, when we're children and adolescents and even young adults, we are more active, and more active we are, the more likely we are to have some sort of accident. We fall down, we get hit in contact sports. Later in life, fractures occur because our bones have gotten weaker. When we're elderly, our bones, generally get weaker because our muscles have gotten weaker. A fracture occurs when the bone is stressed beyond its ability to manage the stress. We know we have lots of collagen fibers wrapped around the lamellae in our osteons. That absorbs a lot of forces, but sometimes we overwhelm that. If our bone is stressed in an unusual direction, it can break. Our legs are designed to bend at the knee, to bend backwards at the knee, not to bend forwards. And sometimes we force that the wrong direction. A force applied to any of our bones can break them. Our bones will break, and our bones will heal themselves up without us having to do anything. There's nothing we do. There's nothing that we to get bones to grow back together again. There's nothing we need to do. That's what they'll do that. Now, they may not grow together correctly, but they will grow back together. What we prefer to do is, if the bone is out of alignment, is to set the bone, meaning realign them, the ends of the break, so that the bone grows back together in a straight line like it should. But even if we don't set it, bones will eventually knit back together again. So we look at bone, we look at fractures a couple of different ways. Are the ends lined up, or are they displaced? Are they displaced or non-displaced? Meaning, do you have to have the bone set, or is it just a fracture that didn't go all the way through and the bone is still fairly intact, or at least lined up correctly? So that's displaced or non-displaced. Is it broken all the way through, or is it incomplete? Children's bones are usually, when they fracture their bones, usually become incomplete because their bones are very flexible, and it's hard to snap a child's bone all the way through. They're just, we call them, in fact, we call them what are known as green stick fractures. So if you try to break a live branch off of a tree, it's very hard because the branch won't snap. It won't snap in half because of the living wood in the branch. Well, the living bone is very flexible, particularly in children, and so the bone will break on one side but not the other. That's an incomplete fracture. Those are extremely easy to treat and to heal up, and for the child to heal up. Complete fracture, though, all the way through, the bone's shattered in a couple of places. It may or may not be penetrating the skin. If it penetrates the skin, we call it an open fracture, an open or a compound fracture. You've got lots of muscle trauma and tissue trauma there. There's lots of blood. It's very painful and very scary looking to your patient. Simple fractures, closed fractures, skin is not penetrated, the bone's not sticking through. So open and closed, complete or incomplete, displaced or non-displaced. And here's all sorts of examples here. This is, oops, let me get back. I won't show you that one yet. Open and displaced, green stick, that's what we're talking about. Children tend to have a lot of green stick fractures because their bones are still pliable enough, flexible enough that the fracture won't go through all the way. A comminuted fracture is when you have bits and pieces of the bone broken off here, and so you have a much harder time putting it back together. Linear fractures are exactly what they sound like, straight line fractures. We generally see that at the ends of the phalanges. If you've ever broken the end of your finger, it's usually a straight line fracture. And the easiest way to treat that is simply use one of the fingers adjacent to the one with the fracture as the splint, or put one of those little metal splints over the finger. That's about all you can do, and it will heal itself. Transverse fractures, straight across, non-displaced. Oblique fractures, spiral fractures. See a lot of these in contact sports, particularly in football. You know, it's a muddy field. It's very sloppy and sticky, and a player goes to plants their foot and goes to make their cut, and their leg doesn't come with their body. It stands there, it's stuck in the mud, and the leg twists, and you get this spiral fracture. It's also common in elderly patients. You know, that the bone is very, very weak, and just simply turning their body can cause that kind of fracture. So lots of different types of fractures. Now, this may be one of the worst fractures ever. This is a gymnast at the last Olympics doing a floor routine. No, not the last one. I guess it was before this past one. She's doing a floor routine, and notice how her tibia and fibula bend the knee the wrong way. She hit the mat at an awkward angle, not the angle she intended to hit the mat with. And her legs bent, her knees bent backwards, and the tibias snapped right here. And notice how, you know, they're displaced here. She's in a great deal of pain, obviously. But notice how her tibias have dropped down. You know, your legs don't look like that. Your legs, you know, we know what our legs look like. You know, both legs, the legs have been severely bent. So this is very unusual. You know, we find all sorts of ways to fracture our bones. This is definitely a unique fracture. Very painful, obviously, extremely painful. Now, this one is probably the worst injury that ESPN has ever shown. This was a Monday Night Football game years ago. And you'll notice that the quarterback, this is the Washington quarterback here, notice how his leg bends in 3 different directions down here. He had his femur snapped because of that. Now, the femur is really hard to break. So is the tibia. And I don't remember if his tibia was broken too, but I know his femur was. And that was the end to him for that game, and end to him for his career too. So because of the way the sudden stress applied to his leg bone, his femur, and his tibia. The shock was too much for those bones to withstand, and the bone snapped. So, and there was a lot of tissue damage on that, and that was. That was, I mean, when your leg bends in 3 different directions like this, that's sort of, that's telling you an awful lot right there. Anyway, stress fractures. The neck of the femur. This is our classic osteoporosis fracture. You know, this is when grandma sneezes or coughs or trips on a throw rug or just stands up. And the spongy bone underneath the compact bone at the neck of the femur has been eaten away through osteoporosis, and it snaps right there from something very simple. Maybe grandma rolls over in the night, or she, as I said, she coughs or sneezes. That's always a good one. Because a good cough or a good sneeze is pretty forceful, and that there was nothing left there to protect that neck of the femur other than the outer shell of compact bone, which is pretty strong, but not strong enough to withstand stresses indefinitely. So how do you treat it? Well, the treatment is called reduction. You reduce the fracture. You realign the ends of the broken bone. Now, in some cases, nothing you have to do. The bone's lined up, you know. Like green stick fractures, there's very little you have to do as far to realign the bone. If it's not a compound fracture, not open to the outside, alignment of the bone works fairly easily. Just manipulate the bone ends until you feel them grating against each other and lined up, and that's how you reduce it. Open reduction requires surgery. You have to physically go in and reattach the bone ends to each other, put them back into position, usually with wires and plates and screws, and it works. And then you need to immobilize the bone so that it has time to grow. Now, and that usually involves the cast, or in some cases traction. There's the treatment of fractures has improved drastically over the past 50 years. Casts are no longer these heavy plaster of Paris structures that have completely immobilized the arm. Now they're very lightweight. We have walking boots now for fractures in the foot that we didn't have even probably 30 years ago. But bones will knit back together again, regardless of whether you do anything or not. It's not unusual to discover patients that have recovered from a fracture and have their bone misaligned. The bones grew back together again, but they weren't lined up properly. No treatment will result may result in a misaligned bone. Now this is a open reduction. Right here we see a broken tibia, and you see a series of screws and plates and pins through here. These are the pins here. These 4 pins and 3 screws. There are a series of metal plates attached to the bone. Fracturing the tibia takes a lot of force, because it's probably the second strongest bone in the body, right behind the femur, and yet it can happen. Now these pins here usually are on the outside of the leg, and so you'll see here with something like this that penetrates through. If you've ever had a fracture with pins involved, the size of the pin is determined where the fracture is. A fracture in your thumb takes a pin that's about the thickness of a nail, whereas something that's a lot, a thin nail perhaps, but in your leg it would require something significantly bigger here. But this is open reduction. You have to go in and insert these structures onto the bone, screwing them into the bone, wiring the bone back together again, and then stabilizing it with this type of device. And that's what it takes to get the bone. That's what it takes to get the bone to line up correctly. Because bone will repair itself on its own without any help from us. Here we see an ulna and a radius. This is a displaced fracture. Looks like a comminuted fracture, and we see to put the ulna and the radius back again. And this is likely from a fall, because when we fall, we put our hands outright, put them down. In elderly people, that's usually how they fracture their wrist, by trying to break their fall. But I can't speculate on how the injury occurred here. But we see that you have plates and screws, and these little things here are the staples that close the incision. If you've ever had staples, staples are probably the worst part about a staple is their removal. I think they hurt more coming out than they do being placed. Anyway, but here, these plates and these screws will stay in there for forever to repair the bone. And the bone will get stronger. It will grow around those plates, and bone will be as good as new. So, hip replacement. We talked about this in lab, but when the hip is fractured at the neck, the approach is to replace the hip. We don't try anymore to surgically reduce the fracture and try and get the bone to grow back, which it will, but it won't be very strong. It's a whole lot, and plus the recovery time for your patient is significantly longer if we try to reduce the fracture, put them in a splint, body cast, and try and let the bone grow back again. The spongy bone's already gone, and it's not going to come back. What we see here is when we have a problem at the hip, we just remove the head of the femur and neck of the femur and put an artificial hip in, and your patient's up and around in 2 or 3 days, as opposed to being immobilized for weeks. And it works. We know it works. We see it work. We see it happening all the time. You have a variety, various approaches here depending on the health of the bone. You can have the true artificial hip, maybe of various sizes. This is one with the stem extending all the way down into the medullary cavity of the femur after the head and neck are cut off. This one, the medullary cavity and the head and neck are still pretty strong. So you have your several options to replace the hip. You also have to replace the acetabulum too, or recover the acetabulum, because if you have a brand new bone, a brand new head made out of titanium, you don't want that grinding against the old worn down bone. You want to replace that and protect it with a new acetabulum. That's what you have to do here. So, and I showed you this in lab, so I'm not going to beat this into the ground here. In fractures, there are 4 steps. You have an injury, and the first thing you have is bleeding, because you're going to tear blood vessels. You tear blood vessels because bone is living tissue. When you fracture bone, you tear blood vessels. So you get a clot that forms eventually to stop the bleeding. That's the hematoma there at the site of the injury. The second thing is you start forming a cast, an internal cast of your own. We will form a callus, a band of connective tissue around the site of the injury, connecting the 2 broken parts. Here's the fracture. Here's the bone, part of the bone there. The other part here. Here's the site of the fracture, and we start growing this callus, thick connective tissue around the injury, and we start running blood vessels through the blood vessels were torn here. Now the blood vessels regenerate through a process known as angiogenesis, and they connect again through the callus. We start then forming a bony callus using the cartilage callus as the model. We lay down a bony callus. We develop spongy bone in here, and then after about 6 or 8 weeks, we've laid down spongy bone and compact bone, and we now have a healed fracture, and we continue to remodel as necessary. And so this whole process, typically anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks. When you fracture a bone, it will heal on its own, whether we aligned it or not, whether we reduced it or not. These steps are going to occur at a fracture. Ideally, your patient's going to get treated to realign the bone if necessary, and they're going to have to deal with some trauma. It's going to hurt. In a lot of cases, if you tear, you're going to have some bleeding because living bone has blood vessels in there. So, hematomas, that's the initial stage of the fracture. It's going to hurt. It's going to be swollen. It's going to be red. It's going to be warmer at the site of the injury. The callus that forms, you're going to see collagen fibers extending across the injury. That protein connective tissue protein in it, and spreading across the site of the injury, laying down this network, this mass of cells. We call it the Fibrocartilaginous Callus. It's like a type of splint to immobilize the ends. Then we start laying down the bony callus. Within a week, we start laying this down. And we start taking the fibrocartilage callus and starting to convert it to spongy bone. And this bony callus will continue to grow and grow for 6 or 8 weeks. And then once we are fully repaired, once the smooth, the compact bone has formed and the spongy bone is fully in place, then it's healed. And then we will remodel. We will remodel the bone until it is as strong as it was before. There will probably be evidence visible that there was a fracture there at some point, but the bone is definitely not any weaker than it was before. It has been fully remodeled and rebuilt, and it is just as strong as it was before the fracture. Now, why do we drink milk? And what is the role of vitamin D? We've been saying vitamin D is absolutely essential. We say we have to have vitamin D so we can absorb calcium in our small intestine. We have to have calcium. We can't. The thing is, we can't lay down bone unless we have calcium and phosphate. It is the crystals of the calcium and the phosphate that give the bone its hardness. So we have to have calcium. We don't have normal growth and maintenance without calcium and phosphorus. Now, the only way that we get calcium in our diet, you can eat all the broccoli you want if you don't, but it's not going to do any good if you don't have vitamin D. Vitamin D is known as cholecalciferol. Vitamin D is cholecalciferol. It is manufactured in our skin by exposure to ultraviolet radiation. We make cholecalciferol. We take vitamin D in multivitamins, and that's great. We have to have cholecalciferol. Cholecalciferol is the precursor of the hormone calcitriol. Calcitriol is made from vitamin D. Calcitriol is the active form of vitamin D. And without calcitriol, we don't absorb calcium in the diet. So we have to have vitamin D. We have to produce vitamin D in our skin. We have to get vitamin D in our food, in our diet. Dairy products, milk is vitamin D enriched. Vitamin D present in a lot of the leafy greens, and that's great. We get vitamin D in a variety of sources here, and we get calcium in our diet, but we need vitamin D because we have to get that calcium into our system. We have to recover it in the small intestine. Now, how do we get calcium in our small intestine to go in through the simple columnar cells and go into our blood? Well, that can only happen in the presence of calcitriol. And calcitriol comes from activated cholecalciferol. The liver takes vitamin D, cholecalciferol, and converts it to calcitriol, which then allows the small intestine to absorb calcium. That's why we have to have vitamin D. Vitamin D in itself doesn't really, vitamin D all by itself is not going to do anything. Vitamin D, however, will be converted to its active form. And what it does is allow us to absorb calcium. Calcium in our diet, calcium from the dairy foods we eat, from the leafy greens we eat, and all the other things that calcium can be found into. Orange juice has calcium added to it now. So we have to have calcium. And practically all the other vitamins are necessary. The big one for bone maintenance is got to be vitamin D. Cholecalciferol converted to calcitriol. And we get our vitamin D synthesized through our skin, or we get it in our diet. So now, problems. What is the pathology of certain problems in our bodies? Well, the big three in bone diseases are what's known as osteomalacia and rickets, which is a soft bone disorder. So we have soft, pliable bones that can't support their weight. Osteoporosis and osteopenia. Osteoporosis is we are breaking down bone faster than we're building it up. Osteoporosis is a bone disorder that occurs when we break down bone faster than we're laying it down. Osteopenia is a precursor of osteoporosis. Osteopenia shows a slight breakdown faster than buildup. Many elderly postmenopausal females don't have osteoporosis, may be experiencing osteopenia. An 85-year-old female with osteopenia has probably got pretty healthy bones because she's not experiencing osteoporosis. Osteopenia is sort of a very, very extremely mild precursor to osteoporosis. A little, her buildup is good. Her bone deposition is good. Her breakdown is slightly greater than her buildup. Not significantly different like in osteoporosis. The third condition is what's known as Paget's disease or Paget's disease. I think it's Paget's disease, where you have uncontrolled bone growth in different areas of the body that cause excessive lengthening of the tibia or the femur, or enlargement of the facial bones, or enlargement of the pelvic girdle, and then going away. The enlargement, however, is not accompanied by any great strength. So it's a very unusual condition. Don't know the cause of it. We suspect it's viral. But it does cause some significant concerns. Now, three other conditions that occur. Gigantism, mentioned this earlier. Excessive secretion of growth hormone, hypersecretion of growth hormone starting in childhood and continuing into adulthood. It's not unusual for your individual to be over 8 feet tall and still growing. The pituitary gland, for some reason, is continuing to manufacture high levels of growth hormone, starting early in life. The individual will continue to grow and continue to grow and continue to grow. Individuals that experience gigantism generally don't live on the average past their mid-50s. So variety of complications that can cause them to die young. Acromegaly. Acromegaly is a condition where after the long bones have closed, after the epiphyseal plates have closed, the anterior pituitary then continues to secrete growth hormone and causes changes to the fingers, to the toes, and to the facial bones. The hands and feet and facial bones continue to grow and enlarge. And you see some distinctive characteristics in the shape of an individual with acromegaly. Doesn't seem to affect anything else except the shape of these bones. It does appear to cause a change in voice patterns, because as you change the shape of the mandible and maxilla, it alters in how sound productions are made. And then the third category is pituitary dwarfism. pituitary dwarfism, where insufficient growth hormone gets released during childhood, and so your adult stature is usually right around 4 feet tall. Now, the upside of this is this can be treated with synthetic growth hormone. So let's take a look at these. Osteomalacia, poor deposition of calcium in the bones. Not enough calcium present, so the matrix, the osteoid laid down by the osteoblast, is sort of squishy. So not a lot of, the bones are not very strong, and they're not load bearing. You know, an individual with osteomalacia, it hurts to walk, it hurts to move their arms. Their bones may fracture suddenly just by standing still. The weight of the torso isn't supported by the long bones. In children, we call it rickets, usually caused by a lack of vitamin D in the diet, or a lack of calcium, or both. And a child will be bow-legged. The legs will bow outward in here. The ends of the long bones get very long, but they can't support the weight, so the legs bow. So, and rickets was one of the, if you've ever seen, and I'm sure you have, in the various versions of A Christmas Carol, Tiny Tim has some sort of condition where he has to use a crutch, and it's been suggested by over time, lots of healthcare providers have suggested, well, it could be any number of things. Rickets is high in the list. When you consider, the time frame when the 1850s, 1840s in England, calcium, the need for calcium in the diet and vitamin D was not well understood. And so, what we would think of as vitamin D and calcium, and it goes away. Well, that didn't happen in this. Anyway, so rickets is osteomalacia, weakness of bone in children. Second category here, osteoporosis. Bone deposition is less than bone breakdown. The bone mass will shrink in size. The spongy bone dissolves away. The spongy bone in the spine, in the vertebrae, and the spongy bone at the neck of the femur are where we usually see this happening. And so your individual with osteoporosis will often have a hip fracture at some point. Will also have compression fractures of the vertebrae. The vertebrae will start collapsing onto each other. Now, this is what it looks like. These are normal trabeculae here, but down here we see what the trabeculae look like as they're being dissolved away, and it gets worse. So we see in this picture here, normal trabeculae, spongy bone here, there's very little left. The individual loses bone mass, the bones become very porous, compression fractures in the vertebrae, very common, so that your patient, your postmenopausal female patient, will shrink in body stature as the vertebrae collapse on each other. Lack of estrogen is one of the key drivers here. Lack of estrogen, lack of calcium in the diet. Estrogen, of course, will stimulate osteoblast activity and inhibit osteoclast. And if there's no estrogen present, then it just becomes reversed. We see these compression fractures. Notice how the vertebrae are bulging out here. The individual will become stooped over, like we see here. The upper vertebrae become wedged. They become sort of like doorstops in their shape, while the bottom vertebrae, the lumbar and the ends lower thoracic, are collapsed on each other. And then of course, then we have our fracture at the neck of the femur right there. So, and we see here that there's very little bone left here at the head and neck of the femur. All the spongy bone's been dissolved right there. I'm gonna have to stop because it's 11 o'clock. We will pick up with this again on Wednesday, wrap up bones on Wednesday. So, and then maybe even move into the muscle chapter. So anyway, that is that's the introduction to osteoporosis. A very common thing. Not every postmenopausal female will have osteoporosis. It depends a lot on diet and exercise, that they have good intake of calcium their whole lives. You know, how much exercise do they walk a lot? You know, so there are many postmenopausal females that don't have osteoporosis, but some do. So, okay, I'll get us out of here and I will see you all later in the week. Thanks for being here.